It's a real pleasure to be here, and I am grateful that you came in on this beautiful day and decided to sit in the air conditioning. That's kind of a perk, isn't it? And listen about water cycle. It's a really, really important subject, and I'm guessing you probably think it's pretty important too. It's become kind of a real passion of mine to talk about it. So we're going to talk about what's happening to our water cycle. And I want you to just take a look at this photograph. It's a photo taken here in the hill country after a rain. There's a little bit of reflection, but you'll see the light spots is actually standing water. And we're going to come back to this photo later in a few minutes in the talk a little bit more about that. There is this idea about the water cycle. The Secretary General of the United Nations declared in May or March of this year, 2023, at a conference in New York City, that humanity has broken the water cycle. So this is a global issue. It's not here. We're suffering. But it's important to understand that there's a bigger picture to this, and then begin to understand what is our place in that bigger picture. So if we look at this, go more deeper, that's what we're going to do throughout my talk, kind of go a little deeper, a little deeper. First thing we're going to look at is the idea now that there are two water cycles. A group of Eastern Europe scientists published a scientific paper in 2007, and they made the assertion there is two water cycles. The first one, the big water cycle, the one we all have heard about pretty much all of our lives, where there is water, evaporation coming up from the oceans and carried inland through clouds and weather events, and brings rain to inland areas. What are we watching right now? Norma, right? Norma is on the Pacific coast, and it's coming across southern Mexico, and they're predicting with some luck, the energy from Norma, they say, will come through Texas. They're saying that places like Midland and a little bit west of us will get the bulk of that rain, but there's a good chance we may get some rain here as well. We also look to our Gulf Coast, and sometimes, at the expense of our coastal, people living on the coastline, sometimes we hope for a tropical storm to come in and bring us some rainfall. And that's the large water cycle, the big water cycle. But that's not the only one going on. So the scientists said there is a smaller water cycle that happens inland in a terrestrial setting where moisture from the soil through evaporation and transpiration comes up, and when all the atmospheric conditions and energies are correct, will fuel a local shower. If you stop and think about it, we have those here too, but they're much farther between now than they've ever been. So these scientists were asserting in their paper that it is the small water cycle that's broken pretty much everywhere, even where they live in Eastern Europe. Again, this is a global issue. So if we start to look at the functioning of the water cycle and the whole global what has happened to our Earth, then we can begin to understand why we're not the only ones that are having droughts and then subsequent floods. And then let us not forget that the wildfires are a factor in this whole broken water cycle situation. So it's all connected. So let's go a little bit further and look at that a little more. So there is this concept of the soil food web. That term was actually created by Dr. Elaine Ingham when she published her dissertation in 1986. My husband and I had the good fortune to hear her speaking in the early 1990s, and I was sort of floored at that time that she was literally one of the first scientists to study the top 6+ inches of soil to find out who lives there and what do they do. So that started off kind of a whole new field, opened up a whole new field of soil scientists science. And ever since then, we've been learning more and more and more. We've learned an enormous amount just in the last 15 years. But in this scenario, she is defined that the energy, solar energy from the sun, is captured by our plants. Good news. That's photosynthesis. We've learned about that. And it pulls that energy down into the roots and it creates carbohydrates. Sometimes they're called sugars and sometimes they're called exudates. But those carbohydrates come out through the roots and feed the microbes who live there. So there are billions of microbes. But for today, we're just going to talk about bacteria and the fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. So these sugars come through the roots and feed them. And in exchange, it's like they made a trade. The microbes provide the nutrients to the plants that they need. So that life cycle of all those organisms down there, that soil food web, feeds each other. So what has happened is that our soil food web has become out of balance. And mainly because of mankind's effect and management of the soil. We're going to go into that more. I'm going to explain more of that, what has happened. But I wanted you to think about this. I wanted you to be aware that it's very, very similar to what happens in the human gut. So I don't know, some of you may have had or know of someone with gut issues. Sometimes, that's called, it's an out of balance. There is a thing called small bacterial SIBO, small SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. I had to stop and think about that for a minute. And there is candida, which is an overgrowth of fungi, and there are a lot of digestive disorders that becomes out of balance usually because of something that we've taken, like it can be like an antibiotic. But there is something that causes a disruption, and it causes an imbalance, and then it causes a health situation in humans. Well, same thing is happening in our soil. We've had things happening that's disrupted the balance of the microorganisms in the soil, and they can no longer provide the function they were designed to do. So these microbes are critical to a proper soil function, and we're going to be looking at exactly how that soil function includes capturing rainwater and storing it for long periods, for months at a time. So these microbes are vitally important. Now, they can't live without the plants on the surface. So what we do to the plants on the surface is very profoundly important. So that's our part of it. We're going to look at that more. So this is just a nice fun picture of the mycorrhizal fungi. They attach themselves to roots and they connect to each other through the network of roots, and they increase this and create this vast network where this exchange is going on. I'm trading and providing food for you, and in return they're providing food back. And it creates a structure in the soil that's called aggregate soil structure. And with that formation, it's like an infrastructure, provides and creates the spaces for water to be stored. So the roots, of course, provide the channels for infiltration. And then the aggregate structure provides the spaces to store water for a long, long time. So this is kind of a slide of native plants. So I'm guessing that the vast majority of you are, real proponents of native plants. But this gives you, so you already know this, but this just gives a nice visual to understand what kind of habitat the microbes need to create that whole soil food web community. And that's why we need native plants. Alrighty. Yeah, we want that next one. There it is.
There we go.
Another little image to kind of help you understand, if you're thinking about it, which side will give a home to those microorganisms, right? So you can look at non-natives, which have, you know, we've gone through, I mean, to be honest, most of our ancestors came from Europe. And we brought with us our knowledge and our preferences from Europe. And so, you know, some of those early European settlers wanted some of the plants we used to have back home, including like the turf grasses. But you can see that they provide nothing for the microbes. And anytime you have a depletion of this root network of roots, then the first microorganism you begin to lose is the mycorrhizal fungi. It is the fungi that really provides most of the nutrients for the high successional native plants. When I say high successional, do you know what I mean?
No.
Okay, so the plants grow, I'm pausing to think of the simplest way to say this. So if you had a patch of ground that was starting from zero, then the first plants that would come up would be plants that could live, germinate and live in that environment that, let's say, has a lot of bare ground to it and may have very few species. And so certain plants can live there and other plants cannot. And so those early plants are fed by the bacteria in the soil food web. So that's when we say it's bacterially dominated. But there are activities that can occur where then that soil food web and microbial community begins to expand and then includes fungi. And when the fungi show up, then that same spot now changes and can become a suitable habitat for a plant that couldn't grow before. And it's a plant that may be taller and broader, that does a better job of photosynthesizing energy. Usually it has a broader leaf, and it's a native plant. We would call them, the ecologists would call it a mid-cirral plant. And then there's a whole other group of high cirral or high succession plants that are, again, bigger and much wider leaves and are much more efficient at photosynthesis and capturing solar energy. During all of this changing on the same site, it can change just a little bit over time on the same site, and the roots are expanding. While the plant succession is occurring, the roots are expanding and creating a greater microbial community. So everything is shifting in that direction. Then something sometimes comes along and can cause it to shift back. Now it can continue to shift back and forth based on events, which might be climate events, but it also might be management events or other kinds of natural events. No spot stays the same forever. You already know that because you've probably been out there looking and working in your own yards. So this is
a question on this. So these natives that have such deep root systems, how do they behave in, we live on a rock shelf.
Yeah.
With very little topsoil. So what happens there?
Well, there are certain plants that are adapted to that. So you would, by your own observation and also talking with like master naturalists, you would come to learn which plants work the best there. But as they grow, as they find their way in and grow and stuff, it's possible that they actually help open it up, and there is more, as the community expands, then you may actually have more viability there for other plants. So there is this process that occurs. Now, there is something we can all watch and measure that helps us understand where any particular site is heading. And that's organic matter, a key indicator. And it's fairly easy to measure. The more studies than I can count, they're all over, and you can find them now all over the internet, have revealed to us that globally 50 to 70% of soil organic matter has been depleted. Wow. And for sure off of our continent. So there's development is a part of that, farming is a part of that, overgrazing is a part of that, and taking some of our marshlands, a lot of them there's some movement toward restoring wetlands, but we drained a lot of them. So all of these kinds of development and affecting plant species and animal species, wildlife species, all of these things have an impact. Not always visible immediately, but they are over time. So we've lost this key indicator of organic matter. Now that's often also equated with soil carbon. But it's kind of easier for all of us, that are just kind of out there working in our yards to really understand organic matter. You can take samples, about 6 inches deep, and you can send it in and have it analyzed for soil organic matter. You can take composite samples if you have 3 or 4, 5, 10 acres, and you can have it analyzed, and it's pretty much the least expensive thing to have analyzed, and you can do it, don't even need to do it every year. You could do it every other year. But if we can begin to restore this begins to rebuild that soil food web community. So this is something that is real important. Now there are scientists studying this and studying with this along, of course, with carbon sequestration. And some of them have made the assertion that if we could restore our soils, restore the organic matter to our soils, it would do more to mitigate this climate stuff going on than even eliminating the greenhouse gases. Not to say that we might need to do some of that too, but that this would be huge to restore that small water cycle. So here in the hill country, let's think about that. Let's look at this next slide. So most of many scientists and many agencies, and this slide comes from our Federal Soil Conservation Service agency, have the science has kind of been locked in that when we improve even 1% of that organic matter in the soil, for every 1%, the numbers vary because soil types vary. This number is saying 27,000. So I'm going to say for every 1% increase, we can begin to capture and store somewhere in the neighborhood of 20+ thousand gallons of rainwater per acre. Per acre. Now I don't remember off the top of my head how many million acres we have in the 17 counties of the hill country. Does anybody here remember? The Hill Country Alliance, I know, has that data, and I don't remember it. But imagine if we started increasing this amount of water for every acre, at least every acre, viable. Every acre that's not already a creek or a river. Every acre that's not already like enchanted rock, a rock. Every acre that has some soil that can be regenerated. Imagine what kind of water. Now on that scale, we could completely refuel the small water cycle for the hill country. So lots of potential here. And my husband and I've been working in this field, as Becky mentioned to you, for 30+ years. But at the same time, then my husband and I took over the management of his family's ranch, which is about 15 miles up the road along the banks of the Pedernales River. And so we started applying a lot of things that we're going to be talking about here. And we saw some real changes. So we saw composite soil samples change from less than 1% organic matter to almost 4% organic matter in a short period of time, in about 4 years. So I feel very assured when I say we can do this. We can make a difference. So here's another diagram that I found about the soil carbon sponge, this idea that when we have high levels of plant diversity, so here's a rural to always remember more diversity is better than less. Always. More diversity. And with that diversity, we have a whole bunch of things going on. We have cooler soils, right? Rainwater is infiltrating and being stored and very slowly being released through evaporation and transpiration. This provides what we need for the small water cycle, and it becomes a sponge. So I'm talking in general about all lands. But we could, some of you maybe have heard my friend Steve Nelly talk, who talks often about just the riparian area. And we have one right down the hill here. And when we really restore and allow that vegetation to really regrow in the riparian areas, they become huge sponges. And with that huge sponge, then you're really retaining water that will sustain river and creek flows for months during a drought. So there's a lot to this to learn and apply. So what we need out of these, some of these, here's 7, some of the functions of a healthy soil food web: retaining nutrients, cycling them, building soil structure, that aggregate structure that will store rainwater, hold more rain and carbon, suppress diseases and pests. Because with that, the more diverse microbial community you have in your soil food web, the healthier the plants are. So we know we've known this part for a long time, that the insects that will become pests, the insects that will feed on plants, for example, they go to the weakest plant. You know, there's that whole science behind pheromones and stuff that they release. And so when a plant is strong and healthy, they're more resistant. We know that. So they also then produce these plant growth promoting substances. That's part of that trade that goes on. And decompose toxic compounds. So this is the function of a healthy soil food web, healthy soils, not just dirt. This is really important. And here are all the benefits. The stream flows will be sustained longer. We'll have the recharge of our aquifers, right? So I hear all the time, and I'm sure you have too, people concerned about well water. Some people who have already seen their wells go dry in certain areas. I guess there's a moratorium on wells going into one of the aquifers in eastern Gillespie County. So it's a big deal. More ground moisture to support our landscape. Well, this is kind of important since so much of our economy in the hill country is based on tourism. That's really increased for Fredericksburg. So we need moisture in the landscape to sustain, you know, the beauty of why a lot of people come out here. Now this is also interesting. Now we talk about flooding and droughts. So if the ground becomes incapable of soaking in rainwater, what happens?
Runs off.
It runs off. And as more and more ground becomes incapable, the flooding becomes worse. And isn't that what we've had the last 10, 15, 20 years? And at the same time, if the ground cannot soak up the rainwater and store it, what does that mean to our droughts? They become worse and worse because there's less moisture in the ground when the next drought comes. So this is a huge way to begin to mitigate both of the damage and impact of flooding and drought, and then improving our regional rainfall pattern. So I need to bring to your attention that we're not the first ones to be concerned. During the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, USDA commissioned Dr. W.C. Loudermilk to research, in this instance, erosion, because the dust erosion of the 30s, you know, everything dried up, the land dried out, the wind picked up and blew everything away. And it commissioned Dr. Loudermilk to study the situation which he did for 2 years, and he traveled the world. And then he published this report. And this report, by the way, is still, this is the front cover, and it's still available on the NRCS website if you wanted to go look it up and read it yourself, which I encourage you to do. Dr. Loudermilk had a pretty strong warning. He identified close to a dozen civilizations that were very advanced for their time. Now, to me, this is a funny thing, what we call advanced civilization. So advanced civilization basically means being able to feed a whole bunch of people living in one area. So in the Middle East, it's specifically in areas that have come to be designated as the likely site or location for the Garden of Eden. Sustained millions of people because they started agriculture. And they started building aqueducts to irrigate. But they didn't understand any of this. I mean, we've only understood this the last 20 years, so of course they didn't understand it. And they ended up breaking their water cycle. And none of those civilizations are there today. And now I think the last thing I read about Iran, where used to be a home to 25 million people, now can barely sustain 4 million. And you've seen the videos and pictures of Iran. So there's just not a lot of green there. Their water cycle is broken. There is a point that perhaps the water cycle becomes beyond repair. So Loudermilk was trying to alert our government, and of course, and that is when a new agency was formed. Back then it's called Soil Conservation Service, and that's the same agency that is now today called Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. And so we need to be aware that we don't want to be going down this path again, and we don't want to be one of those ancient civilizations. So what can we do? So there are 5 principles of soil health. And if you go and Google that, some organizations will give you 6, it varies. But this pretty much is the same, that every, ecological, environmental, and federal or state agency, environmental type agency will give you these soil principles. We're going to look at them. So soil cover, keep plant residue on the soil surface. I'm going to show you slides and we're going to talk about it, but let's just review it. Limited disturbance. Minimal disturbance to the soil disrupts that soil food web. So when we think about all the ways we have disturbed the soil, then you know the answer to the question, well, how did we damage the soil food web? So disturbances can be physical, chemical, in terms of application of herbicides and pesticides, and biological disturbance. Then number 3 is diversity. So it's more diversity is better than less. So let that become one of your mantras. And learning how to utilize cool and warm season species so that you have, the next one, more living roots in the soil as many months out of the year as possible. We have short freezes. We don't have, like up north, like Nebraska on up, they have their freeze and then they stay frozen for months through the winter. We have short freezes and then we warm up. So we really have a good chance with native, adapted, cool season plants to have living roots in the soil almost all year long. So get familiar with that. And then integrating livestock. That's the one I'm going to talk about first because that's the one that most people don't know very much about, and it happens to be the one my husband and I use the most. So we had this ranch, a family ranch that we were managing down on White Oak Road, and we had White Oak Creek that came right across the middle of the ranch and joined the river, and the river was our boundary. And so here's the creek. Now, for a long time, my husband's father kept that bank mowed. So it became a picnic area and family could come and stand there and fish. And over time, that bank started caving in more and more and more. There used to be pecan trees lining that bank until a flood came down the creek and took them all out because there was not enough soil there for them to stay rooted because of the constant mowing. So there was a disturbance. Every time those native plants were mowed down, they had to draw energy out of the root system to try to grow back. And when you do that over and over again, you use up the root system. And then you have no roots down there for the microbes. And then you don't have your proper soil structure. So we let this restore itself once we learned this. And a whole bunch of things happened. But you see that bank now is firmly fixed with the native plants and the root system. And when you do that, the channel is healthier too. There's a whole science about how channels broaden, and then also they broaden out and they lose their depth, and it contributes to drought. So this helps keeps the channel deeper and more narrow and the water deeper, and there's a whole lot of things going on with that. So after doing that for a couple of years, we had this plant just show up by itself, an eastern gamma grass. Never put a seed out, never saw it in Gillespie County. We were ecstatic in that first year. We'd have guests and we'd have grandkids and we'd have friends come stand by the eastern gamma, taking photographs of all, everybody by the eastern gamma grass that showed up. And then the next year, a couple more. And then more. And then eventually there were so many we could not count them, and they lined the creek all the way to the river, and there at the junction they grew a lot because our neighbors were still grazing right down to the water line. And eastern gamma is a wonderful dessert plant for livestock. But we began practicing this concept called holistic grazing management. So we were regulating where the cows were, how long they were there, and then how much recovery time the plants had later. Now, when we're talking about plant succession, this is an example of a very high successional plant. It's very tall. It can be as tall as, easily as tall as me. Those leaves are very, very broad. The roots are very, very deep. They prefer riparian areas because they help make that magnificent sponge that holds the water that feeds the channel. Yes?
Peggy, tell us about sawgrass.
I don't know a lot about sawgrass.
Because our place, 15 years ago, didn't have eastern gamma or sawgrass.
And now both?
All of a sudden, right along the creek,
Uh-huh.
is sawgrass. You can't walk, you can't get through it. And
Okay.
right behind it is the eastern gamma.
Perfect. So this is a type of sedge.
Yeah, and Jim Stanley came out. I think most people here know Jim Stanley.
Yeah.
And said, I thought it was an invasive. And he said, you've got the best 2 plants in the world for your riparian area.
Perfect. Perfect. That's wonderful. Yeah. So I hope you have pictures of them, because people would need to see it. Yes. So this is what can happen. And you didn't see yours, and we didn't see ours. Yeah, they showed up. And that's that concept of plant succession. When the habitat becomes right, then the seeds that have been there can germinate. And I have heard, because I work as a certified professional educator with Holistic Management International, so that's an international organization. So I hear stories globally from lots of countries, but I've heard people say they've seen species return that have been gone for more than 100 years. So seeds, don't underestimate. The seeds can be dormant and then germinate when the conditions are right. Yes, so you don't have to, it's fun. I do it. I buy seed and plant it, and that's fun. But we don't have to. So, now this was the uplands of this ranch. Yes, ma'am?
Well, I was just going to comment on lands that have been overgrazed on the likes of 100 years.
Yes.
Then it's more of a problem, because anything that has managed to come up in the last 100 years has been eaten. And so the
Yes,
sheep
until you
is
start to
really
regulate the grazing.
exhausted.
Yes, but we did that. So my husband's parents bought this land in the 40s, and my husband thought they had a drought then because it was bare ground, but it was all sheep and goats. Okay, so the goats overbrowse and the sheep really eat it right down to the ground. And so as a result, my husband's father in the 50s put in all the bottomland, put in coastal Bermuda because there wasn't anything there. And it had, when you got rid of the soil food web, then you had a bunch of shrubby species, move in and become the dominant species. So when the Indian grass came back, we never seeded it on the same land that had been overgrazed since probably early Europeans. So never put a seed out. So we started having these big stands of Indian grass. And they need a really long recovery period. That's why they're gone. So we managed to create a grazing plan that allowed these areas to have all summer recovery. And we only graze them because native plants that go dormant in the winter have a very high nutritional content. So we set up a grazing plan that grazed these in the winter time. And then they had a full summer of recovery time. Do you know what I'm saying when I say recovery? Okay. That's when we saw the Indian grass show up. So this is one of the bottomland pastures. And so as we began to manage grazing there, we saw lots of species start coming in. And we used a lot of electric fencing, and they would be on this right-hand side, they would be there like 2 days before we'd move them again. And way back in the back, that green is like a little gator where my husband's getting ready to move the fence. And when the cows are every other day getting fresh grass, and they know what's coming, they just stand there and wait. They're just happy as they can be. And then this gives you an idea of what was happening before the grazing and after the grazing. And to remember those soil principles, keep it covered. So we still have a pretty fair amount of grass left because of the short grazing period. They didn't have to keep biting it. And then we had a lot of plant litter. We call that litter. It's a mulch. So it's keeping it cool, and it's keeping it moist, and it's keeping that soil covered. And that was was really instrumental in restoring, how the pasture, restoring the soil food web, which is really what we're after.
Tree fertilizer too.
Yes, the fertilizer.
Hopefully, yeah.
So there are range ecologists, I know some of them, who will assert in an international conference that the only viable way to restore the soil food web is with grazing livestock. And they do that. I mean, we can go a long way in our yards and on our properties doing other things. But they assert that it's the quickest, and it probably is the quickest. So if you go back and do some research, you'll find that all of the arid and semi-arid landscapes on the planet evolved with grazing animals. We call them ungulates, with hooved, with their hooves. They have a stomach that breaks down that vegetation, and 80% of it goes back to the soil through dung and urine. And let me tell you why that's fascinating when you really look at it from the ecological perspective. In environments where there's a very high degree of moisture, like east of the Mississippi, like all of Europe, where most of our ancestors came from, there was a process that was pretty much ongoing called decay. Things rotted. Plants rotted. And it was a form of recycling, breaking them down, becoming nutrients to the microbes, protecting the soil, and recycling. In the arid and semi-arid environments, there's not enough moisture. Plants that are never grazed or knocked down through trampling will oxidize. And if nothing takes them out and helps them recycle in some manner, then the roots will actually die, because they'll choke out the base of the plant, and the base can't get the sunlight the next spring, and it will slowly die. So in these arid and semi-arid environments, various forms of grazing animals evolved to do two things: to eat and to knock down plants, so they would recycle and break it down in their rumen, since we didn't have enough moisture for it to rot out in the open.
Used to be bison.
Yes, bison. But all of our elk that now live at high altitudes used to be out on the plains also. Well, it's well documented. So what you have here is an example. This is a photograph from an acquaintance on a big ranch in another state. And in his story, much drier than we are. Much drier, much less rainfall. Much less humidity. So he started collaborating with a local university, and the university came out and started measuring. And they did this for over a decade. And one of his fields, he did both some farming and some grazing, and then he merged them. So that on his farm, every so often, he quit plowing completely, he quit disking, he direct tilled when he wanted to plant something right into cover crop. He started putting cover crops in for the winter. He started with a few species and gradually worked up with like 50 different species of cover crops. And then no-till drilled right into it, if you know what I mean. So there was no plowing or disking. He was not disturbing the soil. He was creating as many roots for the microbes as he possibly could. And if he needed to plant a crop, his cover crop would be a cool season crop, a cool season variety, which would go dormant in the summer. And then he'd plant his crop, whatever it is he wanted to grow, he'd plant right into that. And so then that cover crop became a mulch for the summertime and for the crop that he was going to harvest. So the university is measuring rainfall on this guy's land. And in one site in particular, the data showed that when they started, that field would soak up about a half-inch rain and everything else would run off. That's it. Couldn't hold any more. And 10 years later, that same field was soaking up 8 inches of rain before anything ran off.
Yeah.
Right. So, and his soil organic matter went to 10%. So it's doable, folks. That's what's so exciting about this particular science. And so you want it to soak in. And so here's an example where right after the rainfall, you don't see any rain sitting up there, and there you do here. Well, that's because it can't soak in. Now this, leaving your field fallow, was recommended by professionals to the farmers for decades. Leave your field fallow. And it was supposedly to capture rainwater. But we didn't know, right? We didn't know. Now we know. And now some things are changing. And that brings us back to that same photo we started with. So when we may not get enough next week, but when we do get a really good rainfall, 2 to 3 inches, kind of, over a few hours or a day or two, and you're driving up and down county roads, look around. Look and see which pastures there's no water standing, and look and see where pastures where there is water standing. Then you'll know where there is a really impaired soil food web. So what can we do? Well, we're going back to these 5 principles. So I've talked about livestock. Now let's look at some of the others. So this is, right now my husband and I live in Tierra Linda, and this is one of our residents in Tierra Linda who's taken her property and putting in all the native plants. You probably know her. I haven't asked her permission to say her name, so I won't say it. But she's a real role model in filling out her property with native plants, and it's beautiful. And so that's one way to do it, is to start really planting instead of grass, instead of a yard. Fill it up with native plants. You can have beds with these nice pathways around them, and when you do this, I promise, maybe not in 1 year, but over time, you'll see so much increase in bird diversity. You'll become a bird habitat, and you'll want to sit out there, and you're going to want to watch them, and you're going to want to listen to them. You're going to enjoy it. More examples, right? Everything that you can do. Any little thing that you can do. But I want to say this. I want to end on this note. So we do live in a drought-prone region. The University of Arkansas did a tree ring study a number of years ago, and they did it here. And they analyzed tree rings back for 480 years. And we have always had droughts. This region has always had droughts. Some far, far longer than any that we've ever known. And maybe we're going back into some of that. So we have to practice water conservation and preservation because we are in a drought region. We are in a drought-prone region. But if we don't restore the soil food web and restore the water cycle, even our water conservation practices won't help. They'll have a limited amount of help. And this is not something that government can do at any scale, even city or county. This is on us, individuals. So I just want to encourage you all. Tell your family, your friends, your neighbors, maybe do something creative and make a little soil club. And you meet every other month and you talk about what you're doing to rebuild the soil. And you take samples and get them analyzed so you can show off how much soil organic matter you're increasing. And have celebrations, have parties because your soil organic matter went up. Let's make this fun and meaningful. It's really up to us. So I'm inviting you to join me on that journey today. Thank you for your time. And we do have, I guess, we have a few minutes if somebody has questions. Yes, sir?
I found it really interesting, the concept that you have a succession of plants and a succession of soil microbes,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so if you really want, say, a high succession plant, you may not be able to plant it in a sterile place.
Exactly.
You have to kind of grow that or evolve that soil up to the point where you can plant something that is native
And
high succession.
Yeah, because it's got to have the microbe there to feed it. So that's a real important point. I hope everybody heard it. And then there are ways to do that. So if you use compost, you want to get compost that's certified, and you want to find out if it's bacterially dominated compost for annuals, and for your gardens are annual. The vegetables in an annual plant. Or if it's fungally dominated compost, that would be more suitable for those higher successional native plants. And so you would want. So there are a lot of ways to do that. Compost tea, it's got to be used the same day it's made. So if somebody's selling it, you got to buy it from somebody who's making it, and you put it out on the same day, or they die.
You say compost seed?
Tea. Compost tea.
Tea.
So it's made like.
Oh, compost tea as in TEA.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes, sir.
If you're using boar goats to control bee brush,
Yes.
is that good or bad?
Well, it will. They're browsers, and they're going to control. But bee brush, and I guess I'm not 100% sure what you're calling bee brush, but
We've got 800 acres of it if you want to come see.
okay.
It's a Loisia gratissima, I believe.
Okay.
It's not native.
Oh, yes, it is. Bee brush?
Bee brush.
Bee brush, white brush, yes, it is.
White brush.
And it's usually
But you may have-
out of control.
but you may
if
have
it's
too many.
An overgrazed area.
So using livestock to manage an overpopulated species is a viable choice to do. What I would encourage you to do is to learn how to manage where they are. So don't leave them out in one area all the time. Have smaller pastures where they'll hit that brush, and then everything else there has time to recover before, and you move them around. before they come back again. Anything else?
You never mentioned the word weed.
No, there,
Weeds.
yeah, right, no.
There
There
are
is,
weeds?
there are no weeds.
Okay.
Natives and
There
non-natives.
are, what do I wanna say,
Invasive.
invasive, there are invasive plants
Mhm.
that have come in, you know, in various ways from someplace else.
Yeah.
The ones though, but even then, if they become fully adapted, they become they're part of the diversity now.
No.
So there are some people who want to get rid of every China berry, right, that's out there. But we had China berry on the ranch, and they grew along the riparian area. But they didn't take over.
Yeah, that's it.
They became a member of the community, and they played a role. They were okay.
That's the difference is if they take over.
Yeah.
I had a whole backyard of multi-star thistle,
Mhm.
and that was pretty much all it was.
Yeah.
I got rid of them, and then I got KR Ranch.
Okay.
And so it, you know, it
Yeah.
depends on what it is.
So now the thistle is native. KR is not, but the thistle is native.
Which one?
No.
Not that one.
Multi-
Not
Not the
multi-star.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
No.
But what I was gonna say, then let me say about the Russian thistle. So the Russian thistle sometimes can come up in a pasture, and you do that in a pasture, and can just look solid. And that happened to us one time, and I was blessed to be a good friend with Betsy Ross, who was well known and a remarkable soil biologist. And she said, no, the Russian thistle, in this case, native, is fixing calcium in your soil. So leave it alone. So it was really hard. My husband, you know, I mean, I almost had to like handcuff it to keep him from going out shredding it all. But we let it go through its cycle. The next year there was no Russian thistle. And it fixed the nitrogen, it fixed the calcium. And it did some repair on the soil. And we had great forages come up in the next year.
Yeah,
Without seeding?
Without seeding anything. It all depends on your soil food web. So whatever is above the ground is a reflection of what's happening below the ground. So now take that and go out and start looking, right? It changes your world when you start looking from that point of view. It's fun. Okay, well, we're going to let the next speaker come up. So thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.